First of all, thank you so much for making time for us.
My
We're
pleasure.
Hooked has been one of my favorite books for a long time, and just
Thank you.
engaging with clients in it every day as we do in the broader world of behavioral science. But the learnings from it still come through very strongly.
I
Um,
appreciate that. Very kind of you. Thank you.
so just very briefly by way of introduction. So I'm Jonathan Stone. I head up our tech and telco team here at MTM. So for the last 25 years, I've been working with clients in the area of healthy acquisition and retention. So full of challenges, full of behavioral science, full of habits and challenges with getting the right people in the door and keeping them and keeping them being loyal and all the things that you can do to improve that. So that's what I spend my day doing, engaging with clients on these challenges. So obviously, just really excited to speak with you. Um,
Excellent. Fantastic. Yeah.
Super.
Lots of synergies to discuss.
Yeah, there really is. Let's deal with Hooked first. So you draw the link there between LTV and frequency and usefulness and habit formation. And within Heart, we talk about how there's a lot of excitement in the early part of a relationship, but over time can become more functional as that kind of excitement, etc., wins. And I think the real question there is how do you continue to build habits, build relevancy, build the kind of usefulness and strength of a relationship over the course of time. So, that's the core part of what your book talks about. I'd love to hear your views on the things brands should be very mindful of when they're building relationships for the long term.
Right. So I take it from the perspective, maybe it's my background from teaching at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, is that I think about it in terms of a competitive moat that a brand, any business for that matter, needs to have some kind of competitive advantage. If you're just in the commodities industry, you don't really need loyalty. I wouldn't waste your time and money building loyalty if you're selling a commodity because your customers don't give a crap. So why should you about loyalty if you're a commodity? Now, very few companies want to be commodities, right? It's very difficult to have an excess return when you're in a commodities type industries, unless you can produce at a much lower cost. So you have to create some kind of competitive advantage. Now, for some people, for example, in the commodities industry, it's about economies of scale. So the fact that the Saudis can sell oil much cheaper than the rest of the world market means they have excess returns. They have a competitive moat. But not every company has economies of scale. You need some kind of other competitive moat. You have to keep out the competition. And so how do you do that? It can be economies of scale. It could be intellectual property. It could be habit is a big one. So habit is the one that I primarily focused on because habit is one where it erects that competitive moat. It makes it very difficult for someone else to capture that customer because it creates what I call the monopoly of the mind. If you think about Google, for example, why is it that Google has 90% of the search engine market? Is it because it has a better product? No. When we do head-to-head comparisons and we give people Google versus Bing and we give them the search results, but they don't know which search result is which. We take out the branding. They don't know which is Google, which is Bing. It's a 50-50 preference split. People can't tell the difference. 50-50. So why does Google have 90% of the search engine market? It's in large part because people have a habit of going to Google. Right? When was the last time you searched with Google and you asked yourself, I wonder who has the better search engine? You don't do that. You use it with little or no conscious thought, which is the very definition of a habit. So when you have a consumer's habit, they don't even give the competition a chance because you've captured the monopoly of the mind. And so it's not that every business needs to be habit forming per se. Lots of businesses will never become habit forming, specifically the ones that have an infrequent use case. Those products have a very tough time creating a consumer habit. But if your product does require a habit, well, then you've got to have a hook, which is where my research comes to play. So if you are in the kind of business where you need customers to keep coming back in order for the customer lifetime value to be greater than the cost of acquisition. If you need them to repeat, so what kind of industries? Enterprise SaaS software, right? Any kind of SaaS business, any kind of health tech, financial services, the list, education. All of these industries require repeat engagement, and of course, across the board, if you can engender customer loyalty, keeping a customer is far, far greater ROI than acquiring a new customer. But of course, we're kind of addicted in the industry to getting new customers. We love to see growth, growth, growth. And I think that, growth without retention is a leaky bucket. You're throwing good money after bad. Because if you can't keep customers, you have no business spending money acquiring new customers, right? You always need to focus on retention before growth. Now, CMOs don't like doing that because they know they can always buy growth. You can always buy growth, right? You want to juice the quarter's numbers? No big deal. Back up the truck and give Google some money, give Facebook some money, give a television station some money, run banner ads. You can acquire customers. It's not very difficult. You just pay for it, right? You can always buy eyeballs and get attention to your customers, and eventually they'll convert. You can always buy growth. You cannot buy retention.
Yeah.
You cannot buy retention. It must be designed into the product experience. So if that is the case, what I wanted to look at was who are the best to breed? Who are the people who are doing it better than anyone else in the industry? If we know you have to have a competitive advantage, habit is one of those competitive advantages. That keeping a customer is a much higher ROI than acquiring a new customer. If we know all these facts, who is doing it better than anybody? And it turns out that Silicon Valley is doing it better than anyone. Why? Because if you look at the line item for how much these world-changing companies have spent on customer acquisition, right? When it comes to advertising, for example, look up, go look up the annual reports for Google or Amazon or Meta or any of these tech companies. Look at how much money they spend on advertising. It's a drop in the bucket. It's almost nothing that they spend. They do spend, but very, very little. Certainly when you compare to, the Nifty 50 of a few decades ago, when you think about Coca-Cola and ExxonMobil, and these companies spend a ton of money acquiring customers, a ton of money on advertising. Well, why don't the tech companies have to spend so much money as a proportion of their market cap on advertising? Because their business model is not about a changing user behavior through what's called the mere exposure effect, right? Coca-Cola has to spend that money on advertising because they know the more times you see the logo, Coca-Cola, 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 the more times you see that logo, the greater your affinity. It's called the mere exposure effect. But these tech companies don't know that they don't do it that way. It's not the advertising that creates consumer habits and changes consumer preferences. In fact, it is the use of the product itself. That's revolutionary. That's never happened before, right? It's because you use the product, you like it more, as opposed to me telling you a million times how great Coca-Cola is. So what I want to do with Hooked was to steal their secrets, was to democratize what these Silicon Valley companies are doing so that the rest of us can democratize these techniques for good, right? So companies like Duolingo use the Hook model to get people hooked to learning a new language. Fitbod uses the Hook model to get people hooked to exercise. All kinds of industries have now used the Hook model since it's been published, since the book was published about a decade ago, to use to build healthy habits, to get users hooked for good.
And as you say, that the relevance of the services in your everyday life is so dependent on your ability to be able to create those habits, etc. And what was really interesting from the heart point of view and looking at the different the different categories that we covered, if you're something like fintech, people are checking their bank balances, they're doing financial transactions every day, whereas something like travel tech, it might be when you're going on holidays, or it's a few times a year. And if you're if you're a telecoms company, you're using your mobile phone every day, but you only engage the brand if you've got a problem for the most part. Right. So just wondered, if you look at those three different categories of companies, whether you had any advice in terms of how you create that kind of everydayness, that kind of habitual usage. Yeah. Describe.
Well, let's take Telco first. So Telco, the reason that Telco has a competitive moat is because of high barriers to exit. Mm-hmm. That's it. Sorry. I know people are getting mad at me over the telco companies. The only reason people are loyal to the telco is because it's hard to switch. That's it. Barriers to exit. If you made it as easy to switch as it would be to switch carriers based on the putting money in a vending machine, people would switch all day long. But it's really hard to change your phone numbers. People don't like their carriers. It's just hard to switch. Same with bank accounts, right? Like once you acquire someone's checking account, it's really hard to switch. Very high barriers to exit. So that's their competitive moat, which is why they spend so much money on cost on acquisition. When it comes to the travel industry is a really tricky one because they almost never habituate their users. There's some, right? There's some. If you're a very frequent user of a travel company, then you might become habituated. So the biggest reason when I do my consulting work, and I've invested in almost 40 companies, 6 unicorns so far, the number one reason I will not invest or consult in a company that wants to become habit forming is frequency of use.
Mhm.
So what we find, what I've seen in my decade, almost 15 years now of being in this industry around habit forming products, is that if the behavior does not occur within a week's time or less, it's almost impossible to change that consumer's habit. It's very difficult. There are exceptions, but very hard to do.
Mhm.
So unless a person travels every week, and there are some people like that, right? Executives or people, who are on the road, or salespeople who are on the road every day, flying around. Yeah, that's the kind of person you can habituate to a particular service. But most people, the habit is not with the travel service. It's not with the airline. It's not with the hotel. The habit is with Google. And how do I know this? Because the cost per click for the travel industry is some of the highest around, because they're just beating each other up on price and features all day long. It's basically a commodity in the travel industry. And all the excess margins go into Google's pocket, right? Because they're renting their eyeballs from Google. Well, what these companies have to do is to create their own habits, or they're always going to rent the eyeballs from Google. So how do you do that, right? And so what do you do with a company that is with a product that is not used with sufficient frequency? It's a real problem. You can't make the behavior itself a habit. Why? Because the definition of a habit is a behavior done with little or no conscious thought. You do not buy airline tickets with little or no conscious thought. It just doesn't work that way, right? That's not a habit, and it will never be a habit. So don't even try and make it into a habit. What you do is you bolt on a habit. You bolt on a habit. How do you bolt on a habit? The 2 C's, content and community. Content and community. So you take a behavior that is otherwise not frequently enough, occurring enough, like making a purchase. E-commerce companies specifically are so concerned about getting people to check out, and they spend almost no time trying to figure out how to get people to check in. And that's a big missed opportunity that you've got to figure out, especially in this age of Amazon, where it's the everything store. You can get anything you want online. That's a habit because people are always buying something on Amazon, right? In my household, it's literally every day, if not multiple times a day. So if you've got a product that's only bought every once a year or once a month, maybe, forget it. You're not going to be able to compete out of habit unless you can bolt on a habit forming experience like content or community. And so we can talk more about that as well, but that's just 2 of the ways you can add a habit to a non-habit forming product.
Fascinating. I mean, content, that's what a lot of the telecoms companies are doing. For example, tie-ins with different subscription VOD companies, for example. It makes sense. It's more regular interactions. What about things like loyalty schemes as a third option on top of content and community?
Sure. Yeah. So loyalty schemes are a very slippery slope, and they tend to be a tool in the unimaginative CMO's toolkit because they come straight out of your bottom line, right? It is a tool of retention, but it costs you something. You're giving away discounts, right? You're giving away free money, and that's coming out of your bottom line. So the problem with loyalty schemes, with points and gamification, right? Gamification used to be a big deal a few years ago, giving people points and badges and leaderboards. The problem with all of these schemes is that you are training and recruiting the wrong kind of customer. You're recruiting the cheapskates. You're recruiting the price-sensitive consumer, and you're habituating them to constantly expect more discounts. I call it the Bed Bath & Beyond effect. I don't know if you have it where you are. In the United States, there's this company called Bed Bath & Beyond. Do you have it in the UK?
I don't, but I used to live in New York.
No. Okay. So you remember this company. So this company, and they used to be very big in New York. I think they just declared bankruptcy, actually. So this proves my point. The Bed Bath & Beyond effect is when you train customers to always expect a discount, and so you don't get anybody coming to your store without a coupon in hand. And this is what Bed Bath & Beyond did. They were so addicted. The company was so addicted to constantly sending coupons to juice their numbers. And I remember when I lived in New York City, I would get every day another 20% off coupon, 30% off coupon, constantly these coupons that you would have to be a moron to shop there without a coupon. Nobody did. I mean, there would be coupons literally at the front entrance as consumers walked in the door. Here, take 20% off. That's stupid. You're killing your margins, and which is why the company declared bankruptcy. So you have to be very, very careful because those are, giving away money is a very unimaginative solution, as opposed to, I talk about this a lot in my book, Hooked, that there are three types of variable rewards: rewards of the hunt, rewards of the tribe, and rewards of the self. Rewards of the hunt, that's about the search for material rewards, right? Money, that could be a material reward. But there are all kinds of non-material rewards, right? Information. When we talk about content, if you can get people hooked onto the content you're making, let's take a travel site, right? If you can create interesting content, you know how many people go on, in the process of planning for a vacation, they're online every day planning their vacation. That's half the fun of a vacation, is the anticipation of the vacation.
Which Airbnb does so well as a brand.
Airbnb, exactly, because people will never book an Airbnb habitually. That's just not how it works. Now, by the way, very, very important they create a hook with the person renting the property. There they have a habit, because that's happening all the time. But with the person renting the property, they absolutely do not have a habit. How do they get that habit? Airbnb is a perfect example. They're constantly creating this content machine about interesting destinations and tours and experiences. And don't you want to come see? And don't forget to bookmark. So they've hooked people, very much like the hook model, to the content around the core experience. Why? Because monetization is a result of engagement, not the other way around. I'll say it again. Monetization is a result of engagement. So if you love consuming and you're habituated to all this travel content, who are you going to rent a room from? Right? Hilton? No, you're going to rent it from the person who's helped you curate all these wonderful experiences, Airbnb. Right? Yeah. So that's how an infrequently used product can utilize what we talked about earlier, a content habit, so that the result of all that engagement will eventually be monetization.
Perfect. And there's a really interesting question that we had in follow-up to the point about manipulations, and exactly what you talked about right up front about getting the right customers in the first place, the ones who are going to stay with you, want to be with you in the first place. And Simon Sinek talks a lot about this as well, doesn't he, in terms of kind of manipulations, and you've drawn on exactly the same point. So, and you talk about internal triggers as well, being much more powerful, external kind of triggers. So I guess the question that we would have for you is, what impact do manipulations have on your internal triggers?
One of these techniques that might be psychologically manipulative, by the way, I think this is way overblown, right? Very few companies have a problem of getting people to over-engage, right? Maybe if you're in social media or video games or narcotics, perhaps, right? But the vast majority of companies, their problem is not that people are overusing their product. Their problem is that not enough people are using their product. Nobody cares that their company even exists. So very, very few companies need to worry about somebody, overusing or abusing their product. So what you do if you ever see one of these ethically questionable techniques, one of these dark patterns at work, and you're afraid of being on the right ethical side of psychological manipulation, all you have to do is raise your hand and ask your boss to run a regret test. What is a regret test? A regret test is when we do what we have always done in user testing, which is when we have a new design pattern, we have a new product. What do? We bring in a representative sample of users, maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 people. This has been done for the past 70 years. We bring them into a room. We show them the product. If you're working on some kind of app, then you show them the design pattern, you show them the user flow, and you show them what will happen, right? You tell them, you make sure that you disclose everything you as the designer of that experience or product knows. This is what will happen. And you ask them one question. Would you regret doing what you just did, knowing everything I just told you? Mm-hmm. Now, you'll never have to run this test. You'll never have to run this test. It has a chilling effect, so that when you are in that boardroom and somebody says, oh, we should do this sneaky tactic, and you say, you know what? Before we release this to the public and potentially get negative blowback and a lot of pissed off customers, why don't we run a regret test with a representative sample of users and see what they think, see if they regret it? Mm-hmm. And what's instantly going to happen? Your boss is going to say, you know what? Not worth it. Let's do something else. Yeah. That's what always happens.
What about in terms of a less nefarious manipulation? For example, just offering, a relatively decent discount, to the point you talked about earlier on, where it's easy to get new customers in the door, much easier than it is to retain them. So giving people a large discount, I think you can get them in, but it's not necessarily leading to a healthy kind of relationship. So more in terms of those kind of manipulations, just, discounts, that kind of thing. What would be your advice in terms of, getting the right customers in the door?
Yeah.
Playing on their
Well, that's not bad for the customer. That's bad for your business, right? Because you're giving, you're giving away your profit margin right there by giving away discounts and coupons all the time.
and
And
it happens
companies,
all the time, right?
it happens all the time because again, it's the toolkit of the lazy CMO, right? That's how you juice your quarterly numbers, and any monkey can do that. That's easy. So what the solution is to, okay, fine, maybe there's a time and a place for a loyalty program or a coupon program, some kind of monetary discount. Fine. But what else can we do? What we do is to figure out what are non-monetary incentives, right? So rewards of the hunt, information. We talked about how content is a form of reward. It is a variable reward that costs us very, very little. It's not 10% off. It's a fraction of that, right? To create interesting information, interesting content. Rewards of the tribe. When you can connect people together, that costs nothing, right? When you look at all kinds of brands out there, I'll give you a good example. I don't know if you have it in the UK, but in America, we have what's called the Hallmark. Do you have Hallmark stores? Hallmark, is that a brand that you recognize?
The card company.
Exactly, the card company. So in America, we have what's called the Hallmark Keepsake Ornament Club. Now, the Hallmark Keepsake Ornament Club, talk about a product that is not used frequently. What do they sell? They sell Christmas ornaments. Now, Christmas ornaments are never going to become a habit-forming product. You only buy them maybe once a year, right? That is not purchased with sufficient frequency. But if you go to the average mall in the United States of America in the middle of June at 9 a.m. in the morning, you will see oftentimes a line standing in front of the Hallmark store. Why? Because when you're a member of the Hallmark Keepsake Ornament Club, you are invited to help them unpack their ornaments. Ah? Did I sell you? Are you enticed? Now, to most of us, that seems like slavery, right? Why would I want to pay to help unpack ornaments? I'll tell you why. And by the way, 300,000 Americans are part of this club. Can you believe that? 300,000 Americans are part of this club because it's not about the ornaments.
Exclusive.
It's a social club disguised as an ornament buying club. Because when I subscribe to this program, I know when I'm invited to help unpack the ornaments, Margie's going to be there, and Rex and Tim and all my friends are going to show up. And so that's what they're selling. What's that?
It's a shared experience.
Exactly. Because all of us as human beings, we need to understand others and to be understood ourselves. So if you can create that community experience, and it doesn't have to be as close as seeing people in person, you can have online, you get all kinds of ways where you can connect people together. That is a non-monetary incentive. So that would be rewards of the tribe. And then rewards of the self. Is there a non-monetary way to create a variable reward around mastery, completion, competency, control? So it's not that coupons and discounts are bad. They're just one tool that oftentimes gets overused, especially when all those other rewards that I described you're not basically paying your customers to be your customer.
We've got a brand over here called Freddy's Flowers, which is a flower subscription business. But one of the things we see in them is it's not just about the act of getting flowers into your home every week or every fortnight. It's building the bouquet yourself and the experience of doing that, etc.
There you go. There you go. So that's part of the hook model. We didn't talk about the 4 steps of the hook model, but the most important and the most overlooked of the steps of the hook model is the last step, which is the investment phase. So the first 3, trigger, action, reward, and investment. That the 4th is investment. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product to make it improve with use. Okay. So the more effort I put into the product, the more data, the more content, the more of my reputation, the more skill acquisition. In the case of Freddy's Flowers, when I make a bouquet of flowers, not only is this my prize creation, I get better at it over time. So the next time I order, it's not going to be as scary, and it's going to be more beautiful, and it's going to be more artistic, and it's going to represent my feelings for the person I'm giving it to. I have invested in the product to do what I call stored value in the product. And so that's really the differentiation between a habit-forming product and a non-habit-forming product, is that non-habit-forming products depreciate. When you think about, your couch, your car, your clothing, all of these things lose value with wear and tear. They depreciate. Habit-forming products appreciate. They get better and better the more we use them because of this principle of stored value.
Yeah. Yeah. And just in that on that point about investment and commitment, I think one of the questions that we often get asked by tech companies is, or the fear is, at a point of registration, we can't ask people to give us too much information because they'll just disconnect. But what I've had, worked with companies in the past which have had, so for example, a fashion company where, during the setup process, they would ask you questions about what it is you needed and what type of fashion tastes you had, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an example of where it feels very relevant to ask people questions up.
Mm,
But in other types of companies, it's just like, we'll just collect an email address and a password and let people get going. But I've always felt that when users aren't kind of giving something away, they're not creating that kind of emotional connection, that
right.
start point to building a relationship and sharing having some kind of exchange. Do you have any advice for those kind of tech companies who are, want to ask things but are fearful of doing that?
Yeah. So this should be a data-informed decision because it depends upon, this is where I would refer to Fogg's behavior model, where it's about the motivation and ability.
Mhm.
So the more steps there are to register, for example, the lower the user's ability. And for some product experiences, if the user has very high motivation, they'll do it. But if the user has very low motivation, then their patience to do something will be very, very low if you task them with too much, right? So what you have to do is based on your product experience, right? What's the user's motivation? The higher motivation, the more you'll get away with in terms of asking them to give you information up front. So it's a very idiosyncratic decision that you have to make for your specific product experience. In general, though, what people don't consider is that you don't have to ask them as much as you think you do, right? That it's always better to err on the side of getting them into the hook, get them through trigger, action, reward, investment. And in that investment phase, that's your opportunity to ask for a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. What companies oftentimes do, and thankfully now we can track all this. Back in the day, it was very difficult, but today we can see our bounce rates, right? If users aren't passing through the registration process, it's because you're asking them way too much. Dial it back. And then you say, well, where am I going to get that information? I can't customize the user experience without the registration information. Well, you do that in the investment phase after the reward. Okay. After you reward the user, again, it's trigger, action, reward, and then investment. So you only get the user to do the heavy lifting, to ask them for more data, ask them for more content, the skill acquisition, all the more difficult stuff happens in the investment phase, not in the action phase. Huge mistake. It's not in the action phase, it's in the investment phase. And you're asking for small bits of information, right? Small bits. Every time they use the product, every time they go through the 4 steps of the hook, you're getting a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And that's how you're personalizing the experience through the investment phase.
To come back to those categories of brands that we talked about earlier on, let's take, say, fintech, travel tech, and telecoms and the major differentiation being, frequency of usage and therefore your ability to create habits. In terms of variable rewards, to come back to your framework, how do you think these different types of companies should go about creating variable rewards in meaningful ways?
So creating the right variable reward must connect to the internal trigger. So we'll talk about the 4 steps. So the first step is the trigger phase. Now triggers, there are 2 kinds of triggers. We have internal triggers and we have external triggers. External triggers are all the pings, the dings, the rings, everything in our outside environment. Those are kind of the training wheels for the hook model, right? In order to start using a product before someone is habituated, they have to be reminded to use the product. That's where all the notifications and mailers and anything in your outside environment that can tell you, to prompt you to action. But the ultimate goal of a habit forming product is to no longer require those external triggers. You formed a habit when the user is triggering themselves, right? Imagine how amazing your bottom line would look if you didn't have to spend all that money on advertising and spammy messaging. If people use the product on their own, the way we check Instagram or Amazon or Google, we don't get a notification 90% of the time, and studies have found this. 90% of the time we check our phone, it's not because of an external trigger. It's not because of a ping, ding, or ring. That's only 10% of the time. 90% of the time we check our phone, it's because of an internal trigger. So what is an internal trigger? An internal trigger is an uncomfortable emotional state that we seek to escape. So when we're uncertain, we Google. When we're lonesome, we go on social media. When we're bored, we check the news, we check stock prices, we check sports scores, lots of solutions for boredom, right? So the ultimate goal of every product, health tech, fintech, SaaS products, doesn't matter. Every product fundamentally has to connect itself to an uncomfortable emotional itch. Once you have identified that itch, and it's going to be specific for your customer in their circumstance, right? Because the way I feel when I come home from work is going to be very different from how I feel first thing in the morning. So it's about catering to a specific time and place for a specific user persona that you can identify. And everyone in your company needs to realize that you are in the business of scratching that emotional psychological itch. If you can't tell me the emotion, you're flying blind. You're just hoping to get lucky. Okay. So whether it's uncertainty, fear, loneliness, fatigue, anxiety, stress, you have to be able to articulate that internal trigger. Because if you don't know what is the internal trigger, you cannot create the right variable reward. So to answer your question, the right variable reward is the one that scratches the user's itch and yet leaves them wanting more. So if the internal trigger is loneliness, well, then the product has to connect people together. But if it's something else, let's say the internal trigger is workplace anxiety, well, we have to give the user assurance and security. So that's how you know. So there's a connection in the hook model between the internal trigger and the variable reward, which is why, by the way, many times the incentive programs that companies arrange, right, whether it's gamification largely failed because gamification works when the internal trigger is boredom. If I'm bored, I want to be entertained, right? That's what gamification does. It's, using game-like mechanics in non-gaming environments, points, badges, leaderboards. That's when it works. But companies got this idea that, well, I want people to do something, but they don't want to do it. So I'll incentivize them. I'll give them points and badges and leaderboards. And it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it serves them what's called chocolate-covered broccoli. Chocolate-covered broccoli is when we think people should eat broccoli, but they don't want to eat it. So we put chocolate on it, something that they do want, and we think that's going to be delicious, but really it's an unholy mess. Okay. And that's what happens when we don't connect the internal trigger with the variable reward, right? If I'm at work and I'm using some enterprise software to get my job done, and my internal trigger is uncertainty or stress in the workplace, I don't want your stupid points and badges, right? That doesn't help me. That doesn't ease my stress and anxiety. Right? So we always have to connect together the internal trigger and the variable reward.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. I love that chocolate covered broccoli. That's use that one again for sure. I mean, that's unbelievably interesting. We could talk about this stuff for hours. So important to healthy acquisition and retention in terms of just making sure you're getting the right people in the right door and using the right kind of motivations to do that, understanding that struggle. But from a retention point of view, understanding that you're kind of offering up those right things and linking what you're doing for people outside of the core service to exactly that kind of underlying challenge.
The feeling.
The feeling.
That's right.
Yeah. The underlying.
Yeah. And it's important to remember it's always a negative feeling. I think this strikes many people as surprising that internal triggers, sometimes I get feedback from people saying, well, you're such a bummer, right? Why does it always have to be a negative feeling? Can't there be the desire for a positive emotion? No. Internal triggers are always negative, because when the customer feels good, leave them alone. They don't need you, right? I'll give you a perfect example. I was on a flight recently, and I was sitting in the middle seat, and next to me in the aisle was this guy who was passed out, clearly asleep. Okay, about an hour into the flight, he tucks a pillow under his head, he's clearly asleep. The flight attendant comes down the aisle, and she looks at him, and she says, "Sir." And he's sleeping, so he doesn't wake up. He doesn't do anything. So she says it louder. She says it a second time. She says, "Sir." And again, now people are starting to look around like, what is she doing here? So she says it a third time. She says, "Sir." And he wakes up. Whoa, what is it? And she says, "Sir, what would you like to drink?" It sounds ridiculous, right? Like, how rude is that? Didn't this flight attendant know not to bother this passenger while he's sleeping? Yes, he would like something to drink, but not right now. He wants something to drink when he's thirsty, not when he's sleeping. How ridiculous. And we do this to our customers all the goddamn time. Yep. We send them notifications and messages and spam and mailing all on our schedule without considering their schedule. We only want to send them these external triggers the moment in time they feel the internal trigger. When you can closely together match the internal trigger with the external trigger in that moment in time, that is the magic moment. The difference between an external trigger that feels like spam and one that feels like magic is one word, and that one word is context. You've got to find the time and place when the user actually has that emotional need, right? That negative internal state, that's when you want to make your product available.
Yeah, and have a solution that solves that struggle that you're having, right?
Bingo. And at first, it's going to be with external triggers. Absolutely. But over time, when you pass people through the 4 steps of the hook, eventually the training wheels come off. They will begin to associate, every time I have this emotional itch, this is the solution to the problem.
Yeah. Do you have any kind of final thoughts for us in terms of, our framework is all about healthy acquisition and retention. Do you have any kind of closing comments on advice for brands in terms of being healthy in terms of those two things?
No, I mean, I think the good news is that focusing on retention and engagement is how we make sure that our customer relationship is healthy, right? Making sure this regret test, that consistently making sure that customers want to do business with us. I think actually the NPS score is a little bit too high of a bar of would you tell other people about it? Like, what if I'm shy? I don't tell anybody about any product I use. But would you use us again? Right? Do you regret doing business with us? That's a very important metric. And I think that's what we need to measure ourselves by. The good news is we don't necessarily have to ask it. We can see it implicitly, right? If users come back to us, that is a healthy sign. That means that we are doing a good job of acquiring the right customers, right? And that's a big part of the challenge, is making sure that we're not, being our head against the wall, marketing to the wrong customer segment, that we're acquiring the right customers. And then we have the kind of product that they want to keep using, because we've designed it in such a way that it becomes part of their day-to-day lives. It becomes a habit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the key takeaway for me, is how do you design it from the first instance to make sure that you do kind of have those hooks to make people keep coming back, which is of course like,
Right. Exactly. So the hook model is really good in the very, very early days, right? Where it's just a pencil sketch idea. That's a great place to use the hook model. Or if your company doesn't have the kind of retention and engagement you think it deserves, it becomes a diagnostic tool. You can ask yourself, okay, do we have the right internal triggers? Are we placing the right external triggers? Is the action easy enough? And how can we simplify it? Are we using the right variable reward types? Are we asking people to invest in the right way? It becomes a diagnostic tool. And every company I've worked with, the challenge is always different. We're not asking for the investment, or, oh, this is the wrong variable reward, or we should make it easier, right? The model gives you a framework to systematically look through these questions that the hook model makes you propose, to see, okay, where can we diagnose the problem and then fix it, right? Then we can come up with hypotheses to test to make sure that the product is actually stickier.
Yeah, perfect, Nir. I can't thank you enough for giving up your time.
My pleasure.
It's been really interesting to apply the principles of your teachings
Thank you.
to the framework that we've put forward. So thank you very much again for your time. I really greatly appreciate it, and hope you.
Sure thing. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.